This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Hey everyone, it's Mark Baer, and you're tuned into When Science Speaks. Thanks so much for being here. Today's episode is brought to you by Baer Strategic Consulting in Washington, D.C., which helps scientists and engineers get funding, gain influence, and build relationships with the stakeholders who matter most. It is such a great pleasure to have Dr. Kimberly Arcand on the show today. Kim is one of the world's preeminent experts in astronomy visualization, and has been a pioneer in 3D imaging and extended reality in astrophysics. She presented her TEDx talk entitled How to Hold a Dead Star in Your Hands in 2016, the same year she was selected as a change maker for the White House State of the Women Summit. In 2019, Kim was featured in the Smithsonian's How to Be a Scientist video series for her work in astronomy and 3D visualization. She led a team of researchers to launch the first ever data-driven virtual reality application of a supernova remnant using NASA data, and has successfully launched subsequent projects in other areas of emerging technology for astrophysics. Kim began her career in astronomy after being hired for NASA's Chandra X-ray Observatory in 1998. In addition to being an award-winning producer and director, she is a leading expert in studying the perception and comprehension of high-energy data visualization across the novice to expert spectrum. Kim's current research involves sonification of spatial data, screen-based holograms, and other intersections of emerging technology and astrophysics. She's co-written 7 nonfiction science books, including her first 2 science-related children's books that came out last year. Kim earned her Ph.D. from the University of Otago in 3D models in high-energy astrophysics data and spatial reasoning skills, and her MA from Brown University in representation of science data, and her Bachelor's of Science in Biology from the University of Rhode Island. Welcome to the show, Kim. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Mark. It's really nice to be chatting with you today.
Now, you have always been fascinated by and really gifted at telling stories. And that's something that a lot of our audience hears about, the importance of storytelling. And I would love for you to share with listeners what makes a story compelling.
Well, thanks for the compliment, first of all. I do feel like storytelling is perhaps not talked about quite enough when it comes to scientific data and sort of talking about how we communicate science specifically. So I don't know that I have any perfect, 5-step tutorial on how to craft the best story. But I can just say that what I've learned over time is there are a few pillars that help me craft stories. And one of them it might sound a little bit odd, but it tends to be that when I start with stories around a personal experience, I have an easier time connecting with my audience. So though it might sound very ego-driven, it's just this idea that when I sort of walk very intentionally and personally from my own point of view, I have an easier or smoother time, I guess, being able to connect with others that are around me and sort of help start those first steps of some sort of hopeful dialogue. So that to me is typically an important one. But also it's definitely a matter of being very honest and transparent in that storytelling as well. So if I'm telling a story about how I started working in 3D models, for example, I might start with the fact that I came across the idea of 3D printing because some colleagues at the Smithsonian were 3D scanning and 3D printing President Obama's head. And it just made me think, well, if they can do that, couldn't I 3D print this 3D model that a colleague had been working on? So there are all of these ways to sort of follow your curiosity, and then also talk about how to be very transparent about how something came to be. So you're not just talking about the hows, but also the whys, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I don't think it's ego driven at all, actually. I mean, I think, first of all, it's very specific. And you talk about such abstract things that are really difficult for the human mind to get its, understand and comprehend and interpret. So making it relatable like that right from the start really grabs people's attention, I'm sure. And you also mentioned dialogue, and we'll get to that in a moment. But another central theme in how you approach storytelling is ethics. And you've noted that speaking to scientists with intention is something, and being transparent, like you just mentioned in your last comment, is something that's really important to you. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, I think I'd like to blame it on a very fantastic professor I had in one of my graduate programs that she studied ethics and was such a great teacher. And, you can go into a class with like not really any expectations on whether you're going to be interested in this stuff, but you think maybe you will. And then you have a dynamite teacher who's just like, really is able to light that fire underneath you. And I had one of those teachers, and she was just so enthusiastic and upfront about these sort of principles and ethics and how they can apply to science specifically. And it just made me realize that I would love to be able to talk about that more and to be able to incorporate that more into my work. And I think I had been doing some of that already, but it was a way of being able to frame my thoughts, I think, a little better. And so those main tenets of ethics, and there are different groupings, whether you're looking at 5 or 6 or 7, but the basics of them being autonomy and beneficence, being non-maleficence, and also justice, of course, but also fidelity and veracity. So I think just even hearing those words, it kind of seems to just gel so well with the idea of science communication, because those are all really important things, right? We want to make sure that we are doing good, that we are not doing bad. And that's, again, really important to get back to the idea of intentionality. It's not just enough to have the intention to do good. You really must also have the intention of not to do harm. And that idea of doing harm can happen when you don't mean to, of course. And this is not to say that people don't make mistakes. Of course, we all do. But just being more clear in your intentions helps guide you towards not doing harm in, I think, an easier, smoother way. And of course, fidelity and veracity specifically, I think, are also really important when you're communicating science topics. So it's this idea of starting from a place where you understand what your own intentions are and what you're trying to accomplish, clearly communicating how you're going to accomplish them, but also the whys you're trying to accomplish them. And I think just having that framework in your head or written down, in a document of some kind before you start crafting your story or creating your materials or whatever, even writing your proposal, just helps not only set the tone, but really drives that outline into the actual material itself. So yeah, I don't know if I explained that very well, but that's sort of how my brain has tried to bring in ethics as much as possible. I think also for me, being a government worker, I don't know, when I was young, like I had this complex, I just wanted to save the world, right? I think probably a lot of kids have that complex, but I really did. I want to save the world. And though I don't think I am actually saving the world through astronomy right now, I do set out on most days with this idea of how can I add some good to the world? How can I take my position as a government employee and make sure I am, propagating that out to all of the taxpayers and all of the people involved in this country and quite frankly in the world, to be able to be sure that everybody has access to the type of data and science that I am very privileged to have access to every day. every day I wake up and there's sort of this like cathedral of the universe that I get to sit in, right? It's crafted through the scientific data, but it is a beautiful cathedral nonetheless. And you can spend your time just staring at the stained glass. And to me, that kind of represents the really beautiful images we can create. Or you can think a little bit more deeply about how was this cathedral built and marvel at just the technical or the technological accomplishments that humans were able to do. So you can think about how the universe was built. You can think about the beauty of it. But that data, it really should be accessible for everyone. So anybody can go in that cathedral and sit in awe or sit and think.
Wow. First of all, I love the metaphor of the cathedral. I mean, you really are taking listeners and helping them understand. Of course, this is why you do what you do and you're an expert, and the different levels or different aspects. And I would say that maybe you started out to save the world, but your scale is the universe. So it's gotten bigger.
Well, I'm definitely not saving. I'm definitely not wearing my universe cape to save the universe. So I feel like that could be a great addition to some of the comic books. However, it is, I think, really helpful to, even if your ambition is much, much smaller than saving the world or saving the universe, to just be clear to yourself and to anybody that you're working with or any audience that you're trying to serve as to what it is exactly you are doing. And I think that transparency is just really important. And for me, it just helps keep my conscience clear and guide me, in the areas that I'm interested in growing or help others try to grow in.
And the other is the why. You really emphasize that. And so many times we lose track of that because we are so focused on a particular topic, and maybe it's self-evident. We're so used to sort of thinking this, we don't even, consider it any longer. But being clear and transparent, as you say, with your audience, whether it's, in a lecture hall, a big auditorium, or when you're writing a proposal as to why it's being done, is just so great to emphasize that.
It's great, but it's also difficult too. I mean, I don't want to, undersell that it does take work to concentrate on that, because we all have so many responsibilities today. And obviously it's a pandemic. So there's layers upon layers of stresses and other inputs, right? Distractions and lack of focus can be real things. But I think it does tie into just awareness. For me, self-awareness is really important. Self-reflexiveness, I guess, whatever the catchier or better described word of the day is. But having that honest communication about your own sort of goals and ideas, and then being able to communicate with others, I think it really does help when you're trying to tell stories about some of these bigger things. Like, as you mentioned, I've adapted some of these techniques because I'm working in an area, there is such huge magnitudes of scale, such esoteric concepts, such abstract images, like it's layer upon layer of fuzziness that we're trying to bring clarity to. But starting with your own clarity on yourself and what you're trying to do can just be really helpful in making sure that you're not fuzzing it up worse along the way.
Such great advice. And it leads into my next question, which relates to some of the favorite stories that you tell about your work to general audiences. What are some of your favorite stories that you like to tell?
Yeah, well, to be honest, I really enjoy telling my origin story.
Yeah, good.
I think, I definitely have comic book themes today. I think my kids are fascinated with the Marvel universe, so I think I can't escape it. But there is this idea of, I have a tendency to start most of my talks with my own origin story. And again, it can sound very egocentric when I phrase it like that, I think. But really the intention is to actually bring in a little bit of the fact that I have often considered myself an outsider in this field, which might sound strange because I've been here for like 23 years. But I started out, I was not in astronomy. I did not, grow up thinking I'm going to be an astrophysicist. I did absolutely want to be an astronaut when I was little, but again, a really weak, pathetic stomach made it very obvious very quickly that I would not be well suited to microgravity at all. However, as someone who comes from biology and into computer science, and then finally into astronomy and astrophysics, it is it is something that is, I think for me, has always been a bit of a flag that, okay, you're not an insider, which actually is not a bad thing. That when I talk about the origin story, it's to sort of help with the audience feel like it's not that you have to grow up thinking you're going to be an astrophysicist to be able to participate in cutting edge astrophysics results and science, right? It really is the idea that the universe belongs to everyone or to no one, depending on your point of view, and that we should all have an equitable and equal opportunity for access to that scientific information and awareness. So I think the reason that I do actually start with that discussion of my career is to help place other people in that sort of similar position, and B, the other thing that's key to me is I do not know everything. And I can't stand it when people pretend that they do know everything because the universe is unimaginably big. So I am not going to know the answer to maybe a third of the questions the audience might have, perhaps, if they really want to deep dive into some cosmology or something else. And I will be excruciatingly honest with the audience to that fact. I don't want to know everything there is about the universe. I enjoy not knowing. I actually feel comfortable in my ignorance, if that makes sense. I like the fact that there's always more to discover. And I am definitely someone who's interested in knowing a little about a lot. That's just kind of the way my brain works. So I dabble here, I dabble there, and I patch it all together in some interesting way, or hopefully interesting way. But I think it really is this idea that when we tell a story, if we are, again, intentional and upfront with our own background and perspective, our own biases, it can help make the audience feel a little better. So that was a very long, rambling answer to your question. But that's just sort of one of the stories that I like to tell. I guess I would say another story that has been particularly fun lately is just something related to the pandemic. And do I have time to go into a second story? Or do we need
absolutely.
To? Okay.
No, absolutely. No, I would love you to do that.
So one of the areas that we've been working on over the past, I guess, about 9 months at this point, is this idea of data sonification. It's just the concept of taking information that is in one form and translating it into sound so that it exists in another form. I love this idea of data sonification because, for one thing, working in X-ray astrophysics, none of the data that we're obtaining is something that could ever be seen naturally with human eyes, right? X-rays are not visible to humans. Our sad little eyeballs and our sad brains cannot handle that kind of data because we weren't meant to. We don't have that in our environment. That's not the way our vision has evolved over time. So it is one of many different kinds of light that human eyes can't directly witness, which means that there is an opportunity there to be able to use any number of senses to be able to, quote, observe or experience that information. So the idea of taking information and translating it into sound has been really pleasing because during the pandemic, we just found that when everything ground to a halt and we could no longer be out in our communities, working with different groups of people, keeping those relationships moving, forging new networks, all of that just kind of stopped in the physical sense. And there were specific communities that we were really losing touch with, and quickly because of that. We had built up a system of 3D prints to be able to work with students and lifelong learners who are either blind or low vision, and had really enjoyed that project. So I personally had found it to be incredibly rewarding because we worked with students to be able to improve those 3D models of things like exploded stars. So it truly was like a two-way exchange of information and was a rewarding project. So when that had to be wiped away because you couldn't be in a room with someone, you couldn't be handling physical objects anymore, you couldn't be putting people's health at risk, certainly, we had to try and be creative. And I think, again, one of my interests is just getting little bits of knowledge from other people and storing it away to parse later. And I had made some relationships with folks who were doing data sonification for other projects already, and approached one team called System Sounds, Matt Russo and Andrew Santaguida, who are up in Toronto. Mm-hmm. And we had a couple conferences together. And I thought, perhaps this would be a good time to do a little more work with sound. I had dabbled, but not really done anything conclusive or interesting with it directly. And so we worked together to be able to create these data sonifications of multi-wavelength data sets of things like the area around the supermassive black hole in the center of the Milky Way, of an exploded star called Cassiopeia A, and a couple other objects as well. And what was done as a sort of rapid response during a pandemic, because we felt like we were losing connections to communities, actually turned into this incredible result that went viral. I could have thought to preload some of it so you could hear it a bit, or maybe you could add it in afterwards with some processing.
We are definitely adding.
Oh, good.
I want to hear this myself.
But it's essentially a way to be able to listen to, for example, the inner 400 light years of the Milky Way galaxy. So as you're sweeping across this data set from left to right across the information, you're including the highest energy information, the X-rays from Chandra. You're including a medium range from the Hubble Space Telescope in optical and near infrared. And then the lowest energy is infrared data from the Spitzer Space Telescope. And each different kind of light, we applied a different sound. So for example, a soft piano for the infrared, and a pluckier violin for the medium range, and then for the highest energy, the X-rays, a xylophone sound. And you can listen to each of them as solos, or when you play them together, it just gives you this mini symphony of the sort of downtown region of our Milky Way galaxy, where all of this activity and action is occurring. And it was such a beautiful result. I almost got teary the first time I listened to it. I can't lie. But it went viral, and it was just incredible for us, for this project to go so big, because we hadn't expected it. I certainly hadn't expected it. I had created it with my colleagues with a specific community in mind. And we tested it with people who were either blind or low vision, and had some positive responses, of course. But to have so many other people around the world enjoy it as well, it was just such a lovely, I think, example of when you try to make something accessible for one group, you can help make it accessible for many others.
Absolutely.
And yeah, that's a favorite story of mine right now. I'm still sort of coasting high on it, because it's just such a positive, sort of feel good story and example of how you can be innovative with scientific communication during tough times,
Sure. Oh, so much in that response, Kim. I mean, everything from when you set out to make something accessible to people who may be blind or low vision, the benefits that you hadn't thought about for people who don't have issues with their vision. Yeah, I worked on a hill on a big overhaul of all the in a section of the Telecommunications Act, which had to do with technologies, the latest technologies, and making them accessible, sort of like a Americans with Disabilities Act, but in the virtual world. And, of course, closed captioning is something that we all love to do when we're watching videos or whatever it is. And of course, that was created initially for people who couldn't hear the audio. And it's been such a benefit for everyone. I have to ask you why you think it went viral. I mean, I'm imagining it, and we're certainly going to include the clip from it. But what do you think about that was so universal?
Yeah, it was a surprise, I think, to see the response. We had, over 1.5 million listens on NASA's SoundCloud within a couple of weeks. It still is many, many months later, the top performing pages on the Chandra website. There were countless news articles about it. If you Google NASA and sonification, you'll see just a ton of articles popping up for it. And again, it was so surprising, but what it came back to, and what I surely should have realized beforehand, is that it did offer not only something new, but also it allowed people to feel comfortable, I think, with that emotional response that we can have to this type of data. And that absolutely can happen with images as well. We have done studies on that exact topic. And, it is very typical for non-experts to be able to look at an image of deep space and start with that wow factor. They process first the awe, the wonder, the beauty, those types of terms will come up. And then they move to the scientific information like, well, okay, what is this we're looking at? What does this part mean? How does this translate? It's usually the opposite for experts. Experts usually start with the questions of what is this representing? What is this showing? And then later on move, oh, well, that's quite beautiful. So it is interesting to be able to compare that. And I think with that previous experience, I should have expected the strong emotional response to the sonifications, because by bringing in some of that, dare I say, art to the scientific story, it really just opened up a new avenue to consider the universe we all live in. And I really have to give such credit to, again, Matt and Andrew, who I've been working with on this project. They really are artists in this area, whereas I'm just a dabbler. But it is this idea of working to improve that type of the way we can communicate and convey different kinds of scientific information in different ways and come up with a result, a product, an experience, what have you, that can be enjoyed by different people in different ways. And that's been very, very satisfying.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, first of all, the emotional, that's what I was sort of thinking about when you talked about, the number of hits and why it was so popular, is that emotional connection. It's just felt everywhere because we're all humans and wired pretty much the same way. And then, I like to talk about connecting before you communicate, and that connection can happen on the emotional level. And then you go into, like you're saying, well, let's talk a little bit more about the details. But first, that emotional connection is so important. And then the last thing I just mentioned, when of course you have the Persevere rover over, right now on Mars. But when there was a lot of information NASA was putting out about the Mars rover, and there was this tweet that went around the world many, many times about the rover saying, it's getting dark and my battery is low. And
yes.
And so I was telling that to my daughter. This is probably a couple of years ago now, or at least a year ago, during the bedtime routine, and she started tearing up and I started getting teary,
Yes.
that imagery, right? And then, but that's a way to connect with people and get them interested in a deeper discussion.
It is. And, it's not put upon either. I have to say, as someone who's been invested and, employed by a NASA mission for so long, there is a true mingling of your own sort of self-identity with these missions and the sort of mission identities. It's, I think, hard to extrapolate sometimes, because that idea of, humans wanting to sort of personify, personalize, none of those are the right words, but attach themselves in a more emotional sense to these things that they're working on or dedicated to. I think it's hard to avoid, right? So it's very easy to feel the quote personality of some of these missions because they're all built up by people, right? You have hundreds, if not thousands of engineers, administrators, scientists, technicians, all different kinds of people that it takes to create the hardware and the software, run the mission, take care of the safety, take care of the financial administration, the computers that run everything. Like, there's so many layers of people that it takes to make any of these missions successful. And I think it's easy to lose sight of that if it's just seen as a hunk of metal, hanging out on another planet or orbiting a third of the way to the moon. But there really are all of these human, informational capsules that are sort of embedded in every single one of those missions. So yeah, I think it's that idea that there are certainly ways to overdo that when you're storytelling, of course, but it is very easy for many of us who've been working on missions for a long time to be able to sort of feel the quote personality of some of them. And also, I think I would just add too, going back, I think, to the sort of emotional response issue, the pandemic has been, I think, a particular year for that being helpful, if not necessary. We have found just an astounding amount of increase of interaction and engagement through our social media channels and our other digital presences, of course, because people needed somewhere to turn when they were stuck at home or just isolated in some way. And I don't think I realized how important that would be. I don't know. I thought maybe during a time of political upheaval, during a time where there was so much to be stressed about, that there wouldn't necessarily be an increase in engagement with astronomy during that time. But we found quite the opposite, because it was a form of escape. It was a form of release. And we've had so many of our users and visitors commenting on posts to that fact, that this has been such a helpful way to be able to escape the trials of the day, or just a perfect place to be able to turn your mind elsewhere. And that, again, was just very rewarding to have. Again, we're not saving the world, but to have any sort of entree into helping people have a slightly healthier, happier view on their day, on their universe, on themselves, whatever. It is very, very rewarding to have even a small part to play there.
Absolutely. And it's making such a positive impact. I love it. We had a chance to talk, Kim, offline a bit. And you mentioned that questions from the audience you call them little presents. And I would like for you to talk a little bit more about that, particularly since oftentimes people view storytelling as a one-way street. And you've made a point to talk about as a big theme of yours, it's a two-way dialogue.
Yeah, I always think I'm a better storyteller when I am having a dialogue. So like this conversation alone, if you go back to like the first question, where it's like the sort of big question, I feel like I can kind of stumble through an answer that's not super cohesive. But when we start engaging more dynamically between the two of us, it's easier, I think, to balance off of the other person's response. You're feeding off of their energy and you're able to respond, I think, a slightly more authentic is perhaps too strong, but just a more natural kind of way. And I find the same thing with larger audiences as well. I'm always the type, if I'm giving a talk, for example, I'm always the type that wants to run way short of the time that they tell you to do the actual presentation mode, because I want to get to the questions. And I love the questions because they really are just these tiny little gifts, like especially if I'm getting to speak with kids or students of any kind. Those are my most favorite questions. And whether it's, are aliens real, or a more specific question about something getting sucked into a black hole, it just lets you respond to their energy and just bring in their perspective into the content, right? You're taking their needs more directly into consideration when you have that sort of question and answer. And I think it's really important to carry that over to talk like storytelling opportunities as well. So if you can think about those questions ahead of time, if you're, say, writing a book or writing an article or what have you, if you've got kind of like an archive of those questions built in from a few years of doing this, for example, I think it does help sort of temper your material in the best of ways, as far as just knowing where the gaps are to fill, or, understanding that if your audience will often have 5 questions on size, scale, or magnitude in any given talk, that's a topic that really needs to be flushed out better. And you need to do a better job explaining some of those concepts. So yeah, I think questions and dialogues from the audience are just such a great way to go. And I guess I would even say more specifically, when you're working on projects that have the opportunity to bring those outside perspectives into it earlier, you will end up with something more successful. So like with each of the projects I talked about briefly today, the 3D printing project and even the data sonification, which I talked about a little bit more. We worked with different people in those projects very early on to make sure, for example, if we're going to work with the National Federation of the Blind to create some sort of event around these 3D prints, well, they needed to be highly tested and really well formed and really well thought out. So you have to take those needs into consideration. And by working with students who are either blind or low vision, immediately after making those models, we made so many improvements to them. We were able to find the right size to make sure the tactile quality was at the right resolution to provide the best information. We were able to cut our 3D models, the 3D prints, in half so that people could have access to the internal information just as easily as to the external information, whether it was the outside of the expanding shell of hot gas or whether it was the internal shell of that had been extrapolated into plastic for a 3D print. And so those lessons and those experiences helped us make all of our 3D models better for everyone, regardless of who is using them. So it really is, I think, just this idea that the two-way street, as often and as early as possible. I mean, obviously day one is best, but even if not, at least day 3 or day 4 of a project life cycle is really helpful.
Yes, for sure. And a wise person I was talking to recently said, you're not writing a book about something, you're writing a book for someone.
Yes, yes.
Really getting those someones involved early, so important. One tactical question too, since questions are such a big part of your presentation, how do you make sure that listeners are comfortable asking them, that you don't just open things up for questions and then you get crickets?
Yes, I love that question. And I knew, well, anytime I do a talk at like a live event or, the dreaded Zoom talks, I do realize that if I have crickets, I have not done a good job. So when I get a lot of questions, I actually feel much, much more accomplished. And I think a couple of my own tactics I've developed for that over time is, one, it goes back to that origin story, talking about where I'm coming from. I hope it makes it a little easier for people to sort of lean in with their own perspectives. But also, I like to say around the question time that, or even during my talk itself sometimes, that I am not one of those people who are going to pretend they know everything. If you ask me a question and I don't know it, I am happy to cop up to that fact. And I don't think there should be any shame in the idea that you're not always going to know the answers to someone's questions. And I think having that kind of, again, transparency, to go back to that term, is really important because it does hopefully help set me up as someone that is interested in hearing interesting questions, that is not going to pretend that they know everything necessarily, but that also that I'm valuing what you have to say. It makes me think back actually to a class that I had done for my daughter's 5th grade. Oh gosh, this would have been back in 2015. Mm-hmm. And we were talking about exploding stars. And I had talked a little bit about how stars evolve and change. And then we did a little activity where the kids used origami to help learn how a star can unpack. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the session, one of my daughter's classmates came up to me and said, I didn't know mommies could be scientists. Mm-hmm. And then she asked a question about the science. And I was so happy with that statement, and that she had a follow-up question. Like the fact that she felt comfortable enough saying that to me. One, I feel like children often do, which is great. And I would wish more adults would feel comfortable as well. And 2, that there was no embarrassment at all. She just hopped right into her science question on stars. And it was something to the fact, like, why do we care about them, or why are they useful? And that was a great question too. And so I felt like I had done a good job that day, being able to help her feel a little bit more comfortable and to give her the tools to be able to ask the questions that she had. So, yeah.
And it's funny because it reminds me, it sort of is consistent with what you were saying regarding an emotional connection and then asking about the data. So the emotional connection, And then she goes into her data question, which is just brilliant. The other was, when you mention ethics, it seems like an underlying theme in your in our conversation has been humility, which of course is a value that would fit very nicely in with fidelity and veracity. And these, as someone who studied Latin, I love references to the classics. So that kind of humility, which leads to authenticity and that kind of comfort with asking questions, because there's no way that anyone could potentially even know much about what's going on way out there.
Yes, I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because I've never thought about it that way. And interestingly enough, a bit of a side note to that is that I think it can be hard to express humility in the sciences, because that's not always the way that science as a community is, quote, brought up to be, right? You are supposed to be the experts in something and to know everything about that one thing. And I guess this is my own slightly little rebellion against that idea, because I don't know that serves everybody's purpose. Perhaps it does 100% serve some, and 100% that's great if that's the case. But I think for me, it doesn't, though. It can be hard. It can be hard to be, humble in a field that rewards that sort of opposite. And particularly as a woman in a field that, again, rewards more, I think, traditionally masculine traits of being a little bit more, I don't know, just a little bit stronger, I guess, in how you're representing your own knowledge and information. But I really do actually, on the opposite side of that, feel that it is a strength of mine that I don't feel the need to represent myself as all knowing, or at least I don't think I do that. Maybe someone else has a different understanding, but yeah, it's a really interesting point to think over.
I mean, the fact that you're very sensitive to that suggests that that's not your way of operating, is to pretend that you know everything. And I guess I would just add that, moving beyond the ivory tower and out there into society in general, I really feel like it's just not credible that someone's going to know everything about everything, or their area, I should say, everything about their area. And so I think one way to, build trust with the public is this recognition that, look, we don't know everything, we're working on it, like the pandemic is a perfect example, because people do want consistency. It's, I guess, from my standpoint, much better to say we're not exactly positive that, this is a brand new virus and things are going to happen, and we might not, we might have to change course, or, not be so definitive in the beginning, because when those course corrections happen, which are completely natural, you have so many, people in the public who are kind of ready to pounce and say, well, that's not what you said before, because
yes,
we want, as humans, we want consistency, but, in such a dynamic area as science, it just doesn't always exist. You're always learning more and more.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think perhaps we do undersell in general that idea of needing to be agile and nimble in science, because things do change so quickly. I mean, you could not have a better topic to talk about that with the pandemic, of course. I mean, over the past year, our approach to how we protect ourselves on a daily basis has had to change dramatically from, the early days when people were scrubbing down groceries and envelopes in the mail, to today where now it's like 2 masks, right? There's been such a change, because you have to be agile, you have to be nimble in your response. And it's okay that things change as people learn more. I think is a healthy thing, right? It's healthier to understand that we don't know everything at the beginning, and that we have to change our perspective as we gain more data, as we gain more information. And I think that just helps everybody when you consider that sort of bigger idea of public trust in science and our own understanding. And astronomy is a great example of that, because, every time, what I think has kept me definitely not from being bored from being in a field for almost 25 years is like, you can answer one question on the universe. And instead of feeling comforted by that fact, you will then be rewarded, I guess, with like 20 new questions on top of it to help show you just how very little it is you actually understand. And I love that sort of uncertainty. And I'm comfortable being uncomfortable with that. But I do think it would be helpful for more people to learn about that kind of uncertainty and uncomfortableness, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting. One last thing on that I would just mention is I sometimes point out to audiences of scientists, being a word nerd in a sort of a Latin class, that the word scientist is a relatively new word, hasn't been around since, well, it was coined in like the 1830s. Late 1820s, and it's a combination of the scientia, the knowledge, but the suffix is the tist, comes from artist. So there's this artistry to the job, and I think that brings, at least from my interpretation, brings forward some of this nuance that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, I agree. And I actually like being a word nerd myself, and I play too many words with friends perhaps, but I do really enjoy thinking about the meanings of these things because it does actually impact your perception on your field or other people's perceptions on your field. And I think it is, going back to what we started talking about, always important to be just self-reflexive, not only as a person, but as a field or as an industry or as a, citizenry. So yeah, those are fun things to think about.
So as we wrap up, and Kim, we've touched upon this topic before. I'm just going to give you another opportunity in case there's anything else that you'd like to add. I mean, just your artistry in making concepts that are abstract and just difficult to perceive, making those accessible. And this is really a big part of what you do every day. And so my last wrap-up question, like I said, kind of reflects what we've been talking about. But when you're thinking about making these topics not merely understandable, but also engaging and relatable to non-experts, how you approach that. And one of the things you had mentioned earlier is, your own origin story. But are there any other sort of, the 3D printing is a great example of that, and even the sonification. So the whole conversation has really been about this. But I'm just wondering if, as we wrap up, if you have any concluding thoughts that you would like to add here.
Well, I think it's just that I do allow myself and for sure my whole team as well, the idea of time to play in that sort of, sandbox of data that we are sort of gifted with in astronomy. We have just an amazing profusion of data to work with. And I think if you don't allow yourself a little time to be playful and curious with what exactly it is that you're doing, you might miss out on some of these opportunities to be able to take these concepts and communicate them in new ways. So for us, for example, the whole process of creating 3D experiences really began because we allowed ourselves a little bit of time to sort of look at some emerging technology and play with it. And that's not to negate any of the intentionality I talked about at the beginning, but just, there is always time for a little bit of open curiosity and open experience, and being able to sort of situate yourself with something, in this case, an emerging technology, to be able to understand what the potentials of it are, has been a really important, I think, foundation of us and however we tell our stories. So what that means is that for us, being able to experiment with the 3D printing or some virtual reality or some tinkering around with sound and attaching that to spatial information, sometimes it just starts with giving yourself permission to not have a deadline or not to have a clear path quite yet, that those early ideas are just about exploration and developing potential uses or use cases for where you might want to go. And I really do think allowing yourself time in the sandbox is an important part for adults. That idea of play is perhaps not talked about enough, particularly in science. And especially, I know how hard it can be when there are budgets and definitely allocations of resources and people looking over your shoulder and all of that. I definitely understand the environment, but if you can carve out time to just be curious, it can really help you drive your stories, your craft, your experiences, whatever it is you're trying to do, into new directions. So, yeah, I don't know if that's helpful, but that's sort of the only thing that I think I didn't really get to touch on today.
I think is very helpful, frankly, because I think oftentimes we view these two things as separate. Your playtime and work time.
Yes, yes.
But as someone who started learning guitar about a year ago, even some of the things that I am doing and learning, I can find parallels to things that other people are experiencing in my day job, and bring those forward. So, Dr. Kimberly Arcand, this has just been a wonderful conversation. So many little presents that you and I thank you for taking time out of your really busy schedule as you survey the universe and make it accessible to all of us. Such a wonderful campaign or cause that you do, much bigger than just simply a job. So thanks for being here today.
Well, thank you. This was just as much fun for me, and I have lots of new stuff to think about myself, which is always the best result of any conversation.
Great.
Thank you for that little present.
Excellent. And we'll make sure to include the sonification sound clip when this actually posts. And listeners, I wanted to thank you for spending part of your day or evening with us on this episode of When Science Speaks. And I hope you'll be back next time for the next episode of When Science Speaks.
This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.